Now it's a great honor and a real pleasure for me to introduce to you this morning our guest speaker, and we are very blessed and fortunate to have him with us, the Reverend Dr. Peter Steinke. Dr. Steinke is a Lutheran pastor and a counselor. He is the author of 9 books, including Healthy Congregations, A Systems Approach, and most recently, Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, both of which are available for sale in the museum shop, and also there are some books available at the Alban Institute table. Dr. Steinke has done work on the cutting edge of perspectives and recognizes congregations, which is very interesting, as emotional systems. And his usage of systems theory to understand the emotional reactions of people one to another when they come together in congregational settings has been extremely important and is groundbreaking. During his career, Peter has developed New Congregation in Virginia, has developed and worked with Center for Disturbed Youth in North Carolina, has established the Interfaith Pastoral Counseling Center in Illinois, and a clergy program in Texas. In addition to developing healthy congregations and healthy congregation workshops, he initiated the Bridge Builder Ministry, which is a training program for churches in conflict. And that is an extremely valuable and important ministry and work. And so now I am proud and pleased to be able to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Peter Steinke.
You can go.
I want to thank the bishop and members of the diocesan staff for the invitation to participate in this convention. I'm going to read the beginning. It's on the sheet here. It's from a poem by G.K. Chesterton. Good news, but if you ask me what it is, I know not. It is a track of feet in the snow. It is a lantern showing a path. It is a door set open. That's the text. Sitting on a park bench, a man noticed a couple of workmen. He was befuddled, somewhat amused. What are they doing, he thought to himself. One workman dug a hole, waited a few moments, and then the second workman filled the hole up with the dirt. When he had seen them do this the third time, his curiosity got the best of him, and he walked over to the 2 workmen and said, "What are you doing?" And one of the workmen said, "We are planting trees. I dig the dirt out of the hole, Charlie puts the trees in the hole, and Chester here fills the hole with the dirt. Charlie's out sick today." Homeostasis. We like things to be the same. In 1803, the British established a new civil service job. A man was to go to the cliffs of Dover and look for Napoleon. If Napoleon were sighted, he was to ring a bell. The civil service job was abolished in 1946. In 1870, the Methodists were meeting in convention, and Bishop Wright invited any of the participants at the convention to come forward if they wished to speak about the new things that were happening in the world. The president of the college where the convention was being held came forward. He said to the audience, "I believe that eventually we will be able to fly in the air like birds." Abruptly, Bishop Wright asked him to sit down. He said, "This is heresy. This is blasphemy. I have read in the scripture that flight is reserved for the angels." When the convention was over, Bishop Wright returned home, whereupon he was greeted by his two sons. Homeostasis, keeping things the way they've always been. And we know that emotional systems like sameness, coherence, stability. We don't like things to change. Elkonin Goldberg, a neuroscientist, has written a book called The Wisdom Paradox. He describes that neuroscience today has discovered that all new information goes through the right lobe of the brain. Eventually, it will cross a bridge called the corpus callosum and come into the left brain and become familiar to us. But all novel information, anything new or different, has to go through the right lobe. And then when we get to know it and it's familiar, it rests in the left lobe. Now, why is this important? Because the right lobe is also the locus for all of the negative emotions: anger, fear, disgust. No wonder we become upset when new things appear before us, when we must deal with differences. It's neurologically based. No wonder we find familiarity and things that are known comfortable, because in the left lobe, that's the locus for all of our positive emotions. We resist that which is new and different. We have difficulty with change and loss and separation because it activates a part of our brain called the amygdala. A-M-Y-G-D-A-L-A. The amygdala is the radar system in the brain looking for anything that might put your being into danger. My amygdala was activated when I was 3.5 years old. Mrs. Magnuson's German Shepherd dog came into our yard. As a prelude to this story, I have to admit that my two older brothers and I often taunted this dog. But there was a wire fence between us. Now the dog's in the yard. My two older brothers are faster than I and made it into the house. I climbed a quince tree, which put me high enough so the dog could traumatize me, but not harm me. It was 10 or 12 minutes before an adult retrieved the dog and put it back behind the fence in Mrs. Magnuson's yard. But my amygdala said, and in fact, remember this, the amygdala is the source of memory for the first 2 or 3 years of life. And so many of the things we remember from early on life are things that threaten us, put our life in danger. But that has practical value, because we do know that lower brain's purpose is self-preservation. It doesn't think, it only reacts. Well, now, as an adult, when I see a German Shepherd dog, automatically my body freezes. My amygdala said, don't you ever forget that dog. I could see a Rottweiler, a Doberman Pinscher. I wouldn't have the same reaction. It's only a facsimile of a German Shepherd dog. When I started a new congregation in Virginia, I knocked on doors and introduced myself, and it was a great spiritual dilemma for me when I had to go to a home where there was a German Shepherd dog. I reduced my anxiety by taking my notebook out, writing atheist, and going to the next house. Anxiety. We all have it. It's the natural human emotion. Paul Tillich talks about the axis of anxiety. Not North Korea or Iran or Iraq, but a deeper sense of something that's more personal. The axis of anxiety involves the anxiety of death, we are aware of our extermination. It is the anxiety of meaninglessness. Life may signify nothing. And the anxiety of fate, which also means the anxiety of uncertainty. We don't have control of everything. And when we become anxious, we are simply instinctive and automatic and reactive and reflexive. And that's what Dr. Murray Bowen called the emotional system. He used the term emotional in a very technical way. Anything in your behavior or mind that is not premeditated, that comes out of this deep, innate, reactive part of our being, that's what the emotional system is about. And all emotional systems are sensitive to anxiety. And when you and I become anxious because there's change, loss, separation, there are differences, we lose our nerve. When we're anxious, we exclude. When we are anxious, we clutch the known. When we are anxious, we tighten the security measures. When we are anxious, we become more vulnerable to the anxiety peddlers who want us to be anxious, to secure our allegiance or to sell us their product. When we are anxious, we adapt to the most immature people in our communities. When we are anxious, we allow differences to be magnified. As Dr. Friedman used to say, differences do not cause differing. It's the amount of emotionality connected to the differences. All polarizations, Dr. Friedman said, are emotionally maintained. So we need to deal with ourselves. What activates my anxiety? How do I deal with you when your anxiety enters into the relationship? Dr. Bowen gave us a way to look at how we might deal with that anxiety. He talked about the concept of differentiation. Differentiation basically means to be able to define yourself and to stay in touch with others. And he defined this as maturity. Now, Dr. Bowen borrowed the term differentiation from the field of biology. A cell, when it matures, is said to have differentiated. It specializes. It becomes a muscle cell, or a liver cell, or a heart cell. A stem cell is undifferentiated. It is an immature cell. So what is so important in our human interactions, in our life and community, is how do we handle these two needs or forces of being a self that's self-defining and yet a self that can connect to other people. By the way, I think this parallels Pauline anthropology. Because there is always the problem, Paul said, that you'll overemphasize the self, or you may overemphasize the closeness. When we overemphasize the closeness, we call it emotional fusion. In emotional fusion, you confuse closeness with sameness. We can only be close if we're alike. Fusion is a term from physics, which means when you melt metals at a certain temperature, the metals begin to lose their properties, their characteristics, and you can't tell one metal from another. And that's what happens in emotional fusion among people. Romantic love is a form of emotional fusion. You mistake an ordinary female for a goddess or an ordinary male for a god. It's craziness, it's illusion, it's blindness. When you do premarital counseling, remember you're dealing with two psychotics. My brother remarried, and he married an Episcopal priest. And he and she asked me to preach at the Eucharistic nuptial. And I started my sermon by saying, when two people marry, they become one. What we don't know is which one. Marriage is a missionary enterprise. Your family sends you out to convert the heathen. We call them in-laws, but they're heathen. They don't know the truth. And unknown to you, your spouse has been sent out to be a missionary. And we try to make each other alike, the same. The first culture war my wife and I engaged in surrounded Christmas. My family, the true believers, we knew when to open Christmas presents. You opened them on Christmas Eve. My wife's family, the heathen, they opened them on Christmas morning. And we fought about this for years and years. We opened them on Christmas morning. My wife was the better evangelist, I guess. But that's fusion, where you give up yourself in order to maintain the community. But in true closeness, in true intimacy, you can remain a self, I can remain a self. Or the way Ed Friedman put it, a true liberal is somebody who's happily married to a conservative. And then we have the other temptation, which is emotionally cutting off. And when we emotionally cut off, we tend to be doctrinaire and dogmatic and opinionated. In fact, I've often said to people, you want to avoid intimacy, become omniscient. You don't need anything from anybody else, and no one will ever want to get close to you. They can't give you anything. And when you emotionally cut off, you tend to get your identity over against another person. So if I can give you a negative identity, by doing that, I can gain a positive identity. But that's a false identity. We saw that in the scriptures where the Pharisee and the publican are praying in the temple. And the Pharisee prays, mea culpa, mea culpa. But the Pharisee prays, thank God I'm not like this publican. I'm not an adulterer. I'm not an extortioner. That's an identity over against another person. It's a false identity. And yet we keep doing it all the time. Now, what about St. Paul? Well, if you go back to 1 Corinthians 12, St. Paul says, the body of Christ better not be fused. If the body were all eye, where would the function of hearing be? In order to have a fully functioning body, you need different parts. And you even need to give respect to the lesser parts because they contribute to the whole. And then after Paul talks about that, he says the only thing that needs to be the same is that you have the same loyalty to the head who is Christ, and you have the same care for one another. Everything else could be different. And then Paul goes into 1 Corinthians 13 where he talks about love. And he talks about emotional cutoff and emotional distance when he says, love does not insist on its own way. That's cut off. And then he refers to emotional fusion. And he says, love is always patient and kind. It gives room and space to the beloved. So when we come into anxious times, how well can we handle our own anxiety in being a self and yet being a self that's connected? On a scale of 0 to 100, Dr. Bowen said the best of the species may be at 70. But he also said we can always increase our level of differentiation. But you can't do that apart from anxiety. So the change that's going on in our world today isn't just something for us to bemoan, because the change is provoking challenge. It's asking us to grow up. It's asking us to regulate our anxiety, even as we try to define who we are and stand on our beliefs and yet stay connected to those who may be opposite of us. And the challenges are coming from all kinds of directions. There is a new aggressive atheism. It claims that religion is a perpetuator of violence and an inhibitor of rational decision-making. It comes from pluralism, this parity about worldviews. How do we as Christians remain distinctive in terms of what we believe, but yet not become exclusive? The challenge comes in the fact that we're going to lose the generation of belongers. From the year 1890 to 1910, every major social and civic organization was formed in that 20-year period. The NAACP, labor unions, the League of Women Voters, Boy Scouts, Red Cross, all in that 20-year period. And people joined. Just 2 decades ago, 2/3 of Americans belonged to a group that met every month. Now only 1/3 of Americans belong to a group that meets every month. About 30 years ago, every one of these social and civic organizations has declined in membership. So there are things happening outside of us, not because we're failing to do things, but the culture is changing around us. Robert Luthnow, in his new book, After the Baby Boomers, has let us know that another challenge will be working with young adults between the ages of 21 and 45. Going to church is not a natural migratory route for young adults. And it's going to become worse, according to the studies of Luthnow. These people are not interested in hierarchical, formal organizations. They are more interested in informality, loose connections. But they are, at the same time, interested in spirituality and even in essential doctrine. But we just can't expect them to come through our door. We have to find new ways to reach them and go out to see them. Sociologists talk about ascribed roles and achieved roles. Ascribed roles are those you inherit. Achieved roles are those that you choose. And what we're going to be facing in our world is, in the next 20 years, those who were so predominantly in the ascribed roles, I'm Episcopalian because my grandmother was and my father was, they're going to disappear. In another 20 years, they're going to be more in the achieve role, where they intentionally choose what they're going to do. This creates a challenge for us. What are we going to do? And then there are the challenges that come from within the community ourselves. Those who believe the divine needs to be gentrified. That old relic of sin and grace needs a new facelift. We've got to change the gospel. Let me read this little story to you. It's written by Dr. William Mule, former professor at Yale Divinity School. Many years ago, when my wife and I had a son in nursery school, we received at his hands a message that chilled our blood. It was a mimeograph note which announced a Christmas pageant and urged all parents to avail themselves of this great cultural opportunity. Since Mrs. Mule and I feel about Christmas pageants the way rats are reputed to feel about sinking ships, we began straight away to make excuses. When we learned, however, that our 4-year-old was to play the part of a shepherd in the manger scene, we decided it was as foolish to make a principle of not attending Christmas pageants as it would to make a principle of attending them. So we agreed if we were in the neighborhood that morning, we would be there. That morning, after canceling 2 classes and nearly running over a policeman, I happened to be in the neighborhood. And when I entered the auditorium, I discovered, not to my great surprise, that my wife was seated in the front row. The teacher in charge announced that the pageant was to begin. The house lights dimmed. The school janitor sneaked on stage with a box of straw, and a purple spot focused erratically about halfway between the pillars. Then from the wings came 3 Virgin Marys. A vague uneasiness came over me. I feared for a moment that we're about to witness the promulgation of a new dogma, group childbirth. But my wife, who is more sophisticated about pageants, pointed out that over the course of years, they acquired 3 costumes. And so the logic which governs pageants meant there had to be 3 Virgin Marys. They were closely followed by 2 Josephs, who took up their postures and picked their nose. Next came the angels, about 20 little girls dressed in diaphanous white gowns and sporting immense gauze wings. They deployed themselves with symmetry across the platform. Then the shepherds appeared, an equal number of small boys dressed in burlap sacks. At this point, an unfortunate discovery came to light. In order to be sure that the angels and shepherds would strike a pleasant balance array on stage, the teacher had made marks on the floor, a circle for each angel and a cross for each shepherd. She urgently instructed the children they were to find the appropriate symbol and stand on it. But unwisely, this marking was done when the children were wearing ordinary clothes, shorts and skirts and overalls. And when the angels came out with their flowing robes, not only did they cover the circle, but the adjacent cross as well. Then the shepherds came on, and who knows by what demonic impulse they were obedient to the teacher, and they began to look for their places. Angels were treated as angels had never been treated before. And at last, one little boy who had suffered all such nonsense he could handle turned toward the wings and said to the teacher, "These damn angels are fouling up the whole show. They've hidden all the crosses." And then Dr. Meehl says, needless to say, Mrs. Meehl and I were greatly embarrassed. There are those who want to hide the crosses, who change the gospel from God cares for you into this more therapeutic statement of God will take care of you. They want to dull the edges of life, erase the data of despair, disguise the darkness. And yet we remember when we were exiled from Eden, we didn't land on the front step of the Episcopal Church of the Holy Nativity. We landed in a swamp. And God came down into this swamp where we've been mucking around so that we might be free creatures. And he allowed himself to be treated by the laws of this muck, but so that all the muckers and muckerettes could be free from this. There are those who would like to make of the gospel only happiness and brightness and delight. But you know, when you know the gospel, the darkness is strangely transformed. Not by the power of easy light, but by the power of God's presence. Remember the Old Testament prophet saying, "You have treated the wound of my people too lightly. You have cried, peace, peace, and there is no peace." And to those who try to make God into this celestial candy machine, we've got to say, the candy machine is broken. It never existed. There's always cost. There's not always payoff. But that doesn't leave us without hope. Because if pain is a motivator without which we cannot live, if our anxiety at times can be a motivator, we also need to combine it with hope. That the present arrangement of things do not need to stay the same. And then this involves us with eschatology. Eschatos is an interesting word. It means the last things. I think it's unfortunate that many theologians have made this the last chapter in their book, because eschatos has a nuance. It means tomorrow influencing today. It means the future having an impact on the present. It means the promises of God being effective here and now. And that's what gives us hope. Archbishop Desmond Tutu spoke about eschatology when he said, never, never, never give up. I've read the end of the story. We win. The Episcopal priest, John Westerhoff, has compared eschatology to a football game. Your team is losing 35-7. It's the fourth quarter. There's only 90 seconds left. Nonetheless, your school band strikes up the victory song. That's eschatology. The Lutheran ethicist and homiletician, Helmut Thielicke, put it in a prosaic way when he said, those who possess the last hour need not be anxious about the next moment. That's eschatology. And so we use our pains and our wounds, but we also use our hopes and our dreams for our motivation. What am I talking about? Change, challenge, and the whole mission of the church. It's going to be different out there. I like the way Walter Brueggemann has put it. In the deep dislocation where God has now placed us, we must do some deciding. While the deciding we face is complex and demanding, in the end it comes down to a few large choices. A choice of a fearful self-preoccupation that invites a shriveled human spirit, or a fresh embrace of this buoyant alternative that subverts fearful preoccupation and calls to a large re-entry into the pain of the world and into the possibility of God's newness. I want to go back to another part of the brain, because this is the part of the brain that we need to tap into if we're going to face the challenge of the future. It's called the left prefrontal cortex. It houses your humanity and my humanity. It's only available in human beings. It's only developed in our lives. This is the part of the brain that allows us to do 5 things. This is the part of the brain that allows us to stand back from our experience and to observe it. But you know, the more anxious we are, the less we can see. Or as Dr. Freeman said, the demons of denial stand at the gates of awareness. But this is what makes us human, that we can step back and we can become aware and we can look and reflect. And that's what Dr. Bowen was encouraging us when he said to be a non-anxious presence, to use calm reflectiveness as an opportunity to see what's out there and not to react and be over instinctive and beat each other over the head. Secondly, this is the part of the brain that allows me to see you as an individual, to see you as an entity unto yourself, and that you have value. This is the part of the brain that lets me see your otherness. Again, Archbishop Tutu. He said, have you ever seen someone throw a bone to a pack of dogs, and one dog say to the other dog, after you? The dog is bound by instinct, but we have this capacity to step back and see that you are important in and of yourself. Thirdly, this is the part of the brain that allows me to think, to be imaginative, to use symbols and language, to converse, to connect with you. This is also the part of the brain that can regulate the amygdala. They can say, that would be a foolish thing to do. Pull back. And perhaps most significantly, This is the only part of the brain that deals with the future. Every other part of the brain deals with the past and the present. This is the part of the brain that allows us to plan and hope. This is the part of the brain that allows us to have an eschatology. That there is an Advent, there is an Easter, and there is a resurrection, and there is a baptism that has some meaning. The left prefrontal cortex develops in the third trimester of pregnancy and develops until the age of 20 or 25. So this is the part of the brain that is greatly influenced by the environment. And of course, in the environment, we're always influenced by people. And if we grow up in environments that are hostile, violent, and neglectful, think of all the kinds of neurons that are being formed. Don't trust life. Get what you can while you can. Or when you grow up in an environment where there is peace, and there's acceptance, and there's welcome, and there's love, then the neurons, you can trust life. You can reach out to another. That's why in my book I call this holy tissue. Holy tissue. I do this every time I speak because I want to say it. I don't know why we in the church are not stronger advocates for children, for natal care, prenatal care, postnatal care, nutrition, good parenting. Because in those first 3 years of life, 250,000 neurons are developing every day. And it's so important then that we don't deprive children of their holy tissue. As best we can, we provide that would bring life and care to these children. Phineas Gage is a well-known person in medical history. He was a promising railroad foreman, but through an accident had a tamping rod go through his cheekbone and out his skull. His friend said, "What a miracle, Phineas is alive." His doctor said, "Phineas Gage is no longer Phineas Gage." A well-mannered, responsible, sociable individual had his left prefrontal cortex destroyed, and he became foul-mouthed, irresponsible, and antisocial. He died as a freak in his freak show. He had lost his humanity. I remember when my mother was dying, she was at the National Lutheran Home in Rockville, Maryland. My brother Paul, who was a CPE supervisor, he and I were visiting her, and we were absolutely shocked when she cursed. Because in all of our life with our mother, we never heard her say a foul word. And when we heard her say these foul words, we were aghast. We were also thinking, what other words does mother know? That was another issue. But she had lost that part of the brain that could control that. Now you and I are facing change and challenge. We can do it in a reactive, reflective, automatic, instinctive way, or we can do it in a more thoughtful and calm, reflective way. We won't come up with the answers overnight, but we do have to be more imaginative. It can't be done the way it's been done. Now, I fault no one for doing church the way we've taught them to do church. We've said so often that being an active member of the church is doing something for the institution. We have to rethink. And I always say, go back to what Jesus said in response to the disciples of John the Baptist. Are you the one we had hoped for and looked for? And how does Jesus respond? Tell them the deaf hear, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the poor have good news proclaimed to them, and the captives are released. That's a wide, very inclusive mission. And having worked in the last 3 years, with 22 congregations in decline and also in conflict, what I've discovered is when the congregation gets a sense of mission, it is less resistant and less reactive if it's connected to mission. So part of our task is to begin to raise the mission consciousness of people in our parishes. Because as a result, a byproduct, there will be less change. But we need to bring the message of the mission. Now I'd like to close by rewriting G.K. Chesterson's poem. Good news, but if you ask me what it is, I know what it is. It is a track of feet in the snow. It is a lantern showing a path. It is a door set open. It is an eschatological Episcopalian. It is an eschatological Episcopalian who likes challenge. It's an eschatological Episcopalian who refuses to be a damned angel but preaches the gospel that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself. It's an eschatological Episcopalian who comes to the Eucharist. And here's the invitation of the Sursum Corda. Lift up your hearts, knowing that there's hope here. Receives the body and blood of Christ, and in doing so proclaims the death of Christ until he comes. And it's an eschatological Episcopalian who hears the second invitation. Go in peace, serve the Lord. And God's people said, thank you. Want to do questions? I'll be glad to.